You step onto the rain-slick streets of Brooklyn 1920s. Neon lights flicker in puddles, coal smoke mingles with the smell of fresh bread, and every shadow hides a story of ambition, loyalty, and danger. One boy works quietly in a tailor shop, missing a finger but not an eye for detail. Another prowls the alleys with silent authority, teaching the next generation the rules of survival in a world where betrayal is fatal. This is the story of Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese and Aniello Mr. Aniello Dellacroce, two men whose patience, strategy, and influence would shape the five families of New York, and leave a legacy that echoes through the city's shadows even decades later. The streets of Brooklyn in the 1910s were a world apart, a maze of brick buildings, narrow alleyways, and crowded marketplaces where every man, boy, and merchant was learning to survive. Among them walked a boy named Gaetano Lucchese, later known as Tommy Three-Finger, small in stature but sharp in observation. A childhood accident had left him missing part of a finger, a visible reminder of both vulnerability and perseverance. But Tommy had something stronger than digits, a mind wired for detail, patience, and strategy. Every stitch he observed in his family's modest tailor shop, every customer interaction, and every whispered conversation in the alley became lessons he stored carefully, like a ledger of human behavior. Tommy's days began in the cramped tailor shop, the smell of fabric and thread mixing with the city's smoke and coal dust. He watched the clients, wealthy businessmen, local store owners, and merchants, carefully noting the way they gestured, the small signs of status, the way respect was commanded and given. He learned quickly that appearances often masked intent, and that a man who seemed generous might be ruthless if cornered. These early observations were more than curiosity, they were the foundation of the skills that would one day make him a formidable figure in New York's criminal and business underworld. Not far from the tailor shop, another boy was beginning his own path through the same streets, Aniello Dellacroce, later known as Mr. Aniello. Aniello's childhood had taught him early lessons in discipline, vigilance, and the subtle power of observation. He understood the hierarchy of the streets before he had learned to read newspapers. He knew the importance of loyalty and the lethal consequences of betrayal. By adolescence, Aniello was already walking through alleys and tenements with a watchful eye, noticing who deferred to whom, who spoke too loudly, and who lingered too long in the wrong place. Every glance and gesture held meaning, and Aniello catalogued them all. Tommy and Aniello's lives, though separate in these early years, were shaped by the same forces: poverty, ambition, and the chaotic rhythm of Brooklyn streets. Tommy's world was one of fabric, measurement, and precise hands, teaching him patience and attention to detail. Aniello's world was one of observation, instinct, and survival, teaching him discipline, respect, and subtle authority. Both were preparing, unknowingly, for roles that would shape the city's underworld decades later. As teenagers, Tommy began to test the boundaries of the streets. He delivered packages, ran errands for local businesses, and observed minor disputes in alleys and storefronts. Every encounter was a lesson: how men negotiated, how loyalty was maintained, and how conflicts could be resolved or manipulated. He learned that influence could be gained quietly, without violence, through timing, discretion, and a careful understanding of human desire. These small actions, repeated countless times, honed his ability to read people and situations, a skill far more valuable than strength or bravado. Aniello, in contrast, began to align himself with local crews, understanding the hierarchy of enforcement and intimidation. He learned that power often came from knowledge and fear, that a well-timed action could shift loyalty, and that patience often outweighed rash violence. He developed a reputation for discretion and precision, handling delicate situations without exposing himself, earning the trust of older enforcers and mentors. By observing, learning, and occasionally intervening, Aniello carved a niche for himself, a man whose presence alone commanded attention and respect. By the early 1920s, both men were entering adulthood and Brooklyn was changing around them. Immigration, industrial expansion, and the rise of organized crime created a volatile mix. Tommy's talents in observation, calculation, and negotiation allowed him to navigate this environment with subtlety. He began taking small steps into operations that straddled the line between legitimate business and underworld influence. A shipment delivered here, a dispute resolved there, a favor performed without drawing attention, all became building blocks of his future empire. Aniello's rise was more direct. His role as an enforcer brought him face to face with the consequences of loyalty and betrayal. He observed patterns, anticipated moves, and learned to guide younger men, including a brash teenager named John Gotti, in the ways of discretion, patience, and strategic action. Aniello's mentorship was demanding but precise. Every lesson was tied to survival, authority, and understanding the subtle currents of power within the Gambino family. As the decade progressed, the paths of Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce remained parallel yet intertwined within the same criminal ecosystem. Tommy's growth within Brooklyn's tailoring and business circles offered cover and legitimacy for his strategic moves, while Aniello's enforcement skills and mentoring created a network of loyalty and influence within Gambino's ranks. The city itself became a classroom, teaching both men the consequences of miscalculation and the rewards of foresight. By the end of this formative chapter, Tommy Lucchese had begun to emerge as a figure whose intellect and patience set him apart from his peers, while Aniello Dellacroce was solidifying his role as a feared and respected enforcer capable of guiding the next generation of leaders. Their combined stories promised decades of strategy, loyalty, betrayal, and power struggles, a saga that would define the five families and leave an indelible mark on the history of New York. Brooklyn in the 1920s was a city alive with ambition, tension, and opportunity. For Tommy Lucchese, the boy who had once watched every stitch in a tailor shop, the streets now offered a different kind of lesson. Every storefront, every warehouse, every alleyway was a chessboard, and Tommy was beginning to understand the moves that would allow him to ascend. He was no longer just observing. He was calculating, testing boundaries, and quietly influencing outcomes in ways that would one day define his empire. Tommy's initial steps into the underworld were subtle. He took on small responsibilities, delivering packages, mediating disputes between local merchants, and occasionally running errands that skirted the line between legal and illegal. Each task offered lessons in negotiation, patience, and influence. He learned that brute force was rarely necessary. Perception, timing, and discretion could achieve results without exposure or risk. These early operations allowed Tommy to gain the trust of more experienced figures, men who recognized the intelligence behind his calm demeanor. Meanwhile, Aniello Dellacroce was solidifying his reputation as a formidable enforcer within the Gambino family. He moved with quiet authority, commanding respect through a combination of discipline, strategy, and controlled intimidation. Aniello began mentoring a young John Gotti, instilling lessons in patience, loyalty, and subtle manipulation. Every training session, every job, every observation was designed to teach Gotti not just how to enforce, but how to anticipate, navigate, and influence, a skill set that would prove invaluable for the next generation of leadership. Tommy's early successes were both small and symbolic. Resolving disputes over protection money for neighborhood businesses, overseeing minor rackets without drawing attention, and negotiating quietly with rival crews all demonstrated his ability to navigate complex social dynamics. He learned that credibility was earned through consistent, precise action and that reputation could often outweigh the power of weapons or muscle. Each calculated step allowed him to slowly extend influence, moving beyond Brooklyn's storefronts into more significant operations. Aniello, on the other hand, faced the constant challenge of maintaining order in a family rife with ambition and tension. He observed which soldiers could be trusted, which were ambitious but controllable, and which might pose risks if unchecked. Aniello's ability to mentor effectively, while simultaneously managing loyalty and fear, reinforced his position within the Gambino hierarchy. His guidance of John Gotti was particularly critical, as the young man displayed both ambition and impulsivity, qualities that Aniello sought to temper through careful instruction in patience and strategy. As the years passed, Tommy began to diversify his activities. He invested in legitimate businesses as a cover for his growing influence in the underworld, using them to establish a network of loyal allies and revenue streams. The combination of legal and illegal operations provided him with flexibility, stability, and the ability to absorb risk while maintaining discretion. He learned to read not only individuals but entire markets, anticipating opportunities and threats in both business and criminal enterprises. Aniello's influence continued to expand, not through personal gain but through strategic oversight. He ensured that Gambino operations ran smoothly, that loyalty was reinforced, and that potential conflicts were neutralized before they escalated. He taught Gotti the value of observation, subtle negotiation, and decisive action, skills that would later allow Gotti to navigate the treacherous landscape of organized crime with confidence and authority. The dynamic between Tommy and Aniello, though indirect at this stage, reflected complementary paths to power. Tommy's rise relied on patience, calculation, and the blending of legitimate and illegitimate influence. Aniello's authority was rooted in enforcement, mentorship, and strategic management of personnel. Both men understood the rules of the streets. Loyalty was precious, betrayal deadly, and power favored those who could see the moves before others made them. By the end of the 1920s, Tommy Lucchese had begun to emerge as a figure whose intelligence, patience, and strategic insight distinguished him from his peers. He was earning respect quietly, extending influence into larger operations, and preparing for the ascent that would eventually place him at the helm of an empire. Aniello Dellacroce had solidified his role as a cornerstone of the Gambino family, mentoring the next generation while maintaining control over the family's darkest operations. Their combined stories hinted at decades of strategy, loyalty, betrayal, and ambition, a narrative that would shape the five families and leave a lasting mark on New York. The 1930s in Brooklyn and Manhattan were a turbulent era, yet also a time of opportunity for those who knew how to navigate the city's complex web of streets, businesses, and criminal networks. Tommy Lucchese, once a quiet boy in a tailor shop, now moved with a calculated confidence through both legitimate and illicit channels. His understanding of human behavior, honed through years of careful observation, allowed him to expand influence quietly but effectively. Every business deal, every negotiation with a merchant or crew leader, became a stepping stone toward his vision of a broader empire. Tommy's ascent relied on strategy. He understood that overt aggression drew attention from law enforcement and rivals alike, while subtle manipulation could achieve outcomes far more beneficial. He invested in legitimate businesses, tailor shops, small manufacturing firms, and import-export operations, which served as both cover and leverage for his growing underworld activities. Through these enterprises, he cultivated loyal allies, secured revenue streams, and extended influence into territories previously controlled by rival crews. His operations were precise, carefully orchestrated, and adaptable, a reflection of his mind at work rather than the flash of weapons or fear. Meanwhile, Aniello Mr. Dellacroce continued to consolidate his position within the Gambino family. By now he was a respected enforcer, known for discretion, precision, and unwavering loyalty. His mentorship of John Gotti intensified, teaching the young man the delicate art of navigating hierarchy, managing personal ambition, and anticipating threats before they manifested. Aniello emphasized that true power lay not in brute force, but in the ability to control perception, manage loyalty, and make decisive moves at the right moment. Every lesson he imparted was rooted in survival, strategy, and foresight. Tommy's influence grew not through confrontation, but through alliances and strategic negotiation. When a local crew attempted to assert control over a lucrative distribution route, he did not respond with violence. Instead, he met privately with the crew leaders, assessed their ambitions, and offered incentives that aligned their interests with his own. By the end of the week, the dispute was resolved quietly, without bloodshed, and Tommy had gained not only control over the route but also a network of allies who owed him loyalty. It was a masterclass in subtlety and influence, demonstrating his emerging capability as a strategist and negotiator. Aniello, faced with his own challenges, managed disputes within the Gambino family with equal care. He monitored potential conflicts between soldiers and capos, mediated disputes over territory, and ensured that loyal operatives remained aligned with the family's broader objectives. His guidance shaped the behavior of men like Gotti, teaching them to combine patience with calculated assertiveness. Aniello's presence was a stabilizing force within a volatile organization, and his influence extended far beyond the actions he personally executed. Both men were acutely aware of the broader dynamics of the five families. Alliances shifted, rivalries simmered, and opportunities for expansion were carefully evaluated. Tommy studied the Gambino family structure, observing Aniello's methods and the respect he commanded, taking note of strategies that could be adapted to his own ascent. Similarly, Aniello monitored Lucchese's growth and potential threats, ensuring that the Gambino family maintained its influence and prepared for any challenges that might arise. The city was a chessboard, and both men were already thinking several moves ahead. During this period, Tommy began to formalize his operations, creating a system of oversight and delegation that allowed him to manage multiple ventures simultaneously. Trusted associates executed tasks under his guidance, while he maintained control over strategy and critical decisions. Aniello employed a similar approach, ensuring that each operation within Gambino was monitored, disciplined, and aligned with the family's objectives. Both men exemplified the combination of leadership, foresight, and meticulous control that would define their reputations. By the late 1930s, Tommy Lucchese had transformed from an observant boy in a tailor shop to a figure of influence in Brooklyn and Manhattan. His reputation for intelligence, discretion, and strategic acumen distinguished him from peers, and his operations extended into both legitimate and criminal spheres. Aniello Dellacroce, through enforcement, mentorship, and strategic management, had solidified his role as a central figure within the Gambino family, shaping the next generation of leaders and maintaining cohesion in a volatile environment. The decade ended with both men poised for even greater influence. Tommy's network of loyal allies and diversified operations positioned him to rise further within the underworld, while Aniello's disciplined guidance and enforcement ensured the Gambino family remained powerful, stable, and respected. The city itself had become a proving ground, teaching lessons in strategy, loyalty, and the subtle application of authority. And as their stories unfolded, the foundations were laid for decades of ambition, power, and intrigue that would define the five families and leave an indelible mark on New York. By the early 1940s, Brooklyn and Manhattan had transformed into a complex tapestry of business, politics, and underworld power. Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese, once a cautious observer in a tailor shop, was now actively shaping that landscape. His influence had expanded beyond small disputes and minor operations. He now oversaw multiple businesses, legitimate and illicit, each carefully structured to provide revenue, cover, and leverage. Tommy understood the duality of his position. To remain untouchable, he had to navigate both the legal world and the shadows with equal precision. Tommy's approach was methodical. He organized his associates into disciplined crews, delegating responsibilities while maintaining ultimate control over strategy. Every shipment, every collection, every negotiation was overseen carefully, with redundancies in place to prevent mistakes or exposure. He learned to read not only people but entire systems, which politicians could be swayed, which merchants were loyal, and which rivals could be manipulated. Tommy's intelligence and patience became his greatest weapons, allowing him to expand influence quietly but decisively. Meanwhile, Aniello Mr. Dellacroce continued to solidify his reputation as a feared enforcer and strategist within the Gambino family. By now he was mentoring a young John Gotti, whose ambition and brashness required careful guidance. Aniello's lessons went beyond intimidation. They encompassed patience, situational awareness, and subtle negotiation. He taught Gotti to anticipate rivals' moves, manage allies' expectations, and maintain loyalty through both respect and calculated fear. Every encounter, every assignment, was a classroom for the next generation of underworld leadership. Tommy's consolidation of influence was often subtle but effective. When a rival crew attempted to encroach on one of his territories, he did not respond with immediate force. Instead, he leveraged relationships, offering incentives to key figures while isolating dissenters. Through careful observation and negotiation, he resolved the conflict without violence, increasing loyalty and reinforcing his authority. His reputation as a strategist, calm, calculating, and patient, grew steadily, earning him respect even among rivals who might have otherwise challenged him. Aniello faced similar challenges in the Gambino family. Rival factions tested boundaries, ambitions threatened stability, and law enforcement scrutiny was increasing. Aniello responded with disciplined precision, ensuring that operations continued smoothly while reinforcing loyalty among his subordinates. His mentorship of Gotti was instrumental, instilling in the young man the value of strategic patience, discretion, and calculated action. Through this guidance, Aniello ensured the continuity of Gambino power while preparing the next generation of leaders to navigate an increasingly complex landscape. During this period, the five families operated in a delicate balance. Tommy observed the Gambino family closely, noting Aniello's methods and the respect he commanded. He adapted similar principles within Lucchese, compartmentalizing operations, cultivating loyalty, and rewarding competence while mitigating risks. Both men understood that power was not maintained by aggression alone. It required the orchestration of perception, loyalty, and influence. The city itself had become a living classroom, where observation, patience, and strategic action dictated survival and success. Tommy's expanding empire included legitimate businesses that provided both revenue and cover for underworld activities. Tailor shops, import-export operations, and small manufacturing ventures allowed him to launder funds, build relationships, and create a network of allies whose loyalty was cultivated carefully. Each business was not just a source of income, but a strategic node in a broader system of influence. Through meticulous planning and execution, Tommy ensured that his operations were resilient to disruption, whether from rivals or law enforcement. Aniello's influence extended through enforcement, mentorship, and strategic oversight. He maintained discipline within the Gambino family, resolved internal disputes before they escalated, and guided Gotti in the subtle management of power and loyalty. Aniello understood that patience and foresight were as critical as physical strength, and he demonstrated that true authority required both precision and perception. His ability to manage human behavior, anticipate challenges, and orchestrate outcomes quietly reinforced his position as a central figure within the Gambino family. By the mid-1940s, both Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce had solidified their positions. Tommy's reputation as a disciplined, intelligent strategist made him a central figure within Lucchese, capable of managing complex operations and expanding influence across Brooklyn and Manhattan. Aniello's mentorship, enforcement, and strategic control ensured Gambino's stability and prepared future leaders for the challenges ahead. Together, their actions, strategies, and understanding of human behavior were shaping the five families, laying the foundation for decades of power, loyalty, and influence. The lessons of these years were clear. In the world of New York's underworld, patience, observation, and strategic action were more powerful than brute force. Loyalty had to be cultivated, not commanded. Influence required subtlety, foresight, and adaptability. Tommy and Aniello were not merely participants in the game, they were architects of it, quietly but decisively shaping the dynamics of power, authority, and ambition that would define the Mafia for generations to come. By the late 1940s, Tommy Lucchese had transitioned from a careful observer into a figure of undeniable influence. His early investments in legitimate businesses had provided cover and revenue, but his strategic insight was what truly set him apart. He understood that the path to power in New York's underworld required a balance between visibility and discretion. Every move, whether in a tailor shop, a shipping dock, or a warehouse office, was calculated to increase influence while minimizing risk. Tommy's reputation for patience, intelligence, and foresight spread quietly through Brooklyn and Manhattan, earning him respect even from potential rivals. Tommy's empire began to take shape in tangible ways. He consolidated control over certain neighborhoods, aligning with loyal associates and neutralizing potential threats through negotiation, subtle pressure, or strategic incentives. Unlike more impulsive gangsters, he rarely resorted to violence unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he orchestrated outcomes through careful manipulation of relationships, leveraging both fear and respect. Each alliance he forged strengthened his network and increased his leverage across the city, creating a layered structure of influence that would support his long-term ambitions. Meanwhile, Aniello Mr. Dellacroce continued to cement his role as the backbone of the Gambino family. As a seasoned enforcer and strategist, Aniello managed disputes, ensured loyalty, and trained the next generation of leaders, including the ambitious John Gotti. Aniello's mentorship emphasized patience, calculation, and understanding human behavior, skills that would prove essential for Gotti's rise. He taught Gotti to anticipate rival moves, manage egos, and maintain authority without overt aggression. Each lesson was grounded in the reality of Brooklyn streets, where miscalculation could be fatal. Tommy's expansion was not limited to territory, it extended into financial influence. He developed a network of legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses that could interact seamlessly with underworld operations. This duality provided both cover and flexibility, allowing him to maneuver with precision even under scrutiny from rival families or law enforcement. Import-export operations, construction contracts, and garment businesses became strategic nodes within his growing empire, reinforcing his authority and reach. Every employee, every manager, and every transaction was carefully aligned to serve both practical and strategic objectives. Aniello, aware of the broader dynamics of the five families, worked to protect Gambino's influence while neutralizing emerging threats. Rival families attempted minor encroachments, testing boundaries and challenging territories. Aniello's response was calculated and measured. He reassessed loyalties, applied subtle pressure where necessary, and ensured that disputes were resolved without exposing leadership to risk. His enforcement was precise. His guidance of Gotti ensured that the next generation could continue these strategies with discipline and intelligence. During this period, the interplay between Tommy and Aniello, though indirect, demonstrated complementary strategies. Tommy expanded influence quietly, blending legitimate enterprise with underworld control, while Aniello maintained discipline and oversight, ensuring stability within his own family. Both men understood the importance of perception. Authority depended as much on the respect and fear you commanded as on actual power. Each operation, negotiation, and strategic decision reinforced this principle, allowing their respective families to grow stronger without unnecessary conflict. Tommy also began to consolidate his associates into a loyal inner circle. Trusted lieutenants managed operations under his direction, while he focused on broader strategy and long-term planning. This delegation allowed him to expand efficiently while minimizing personal risk. Aniello applied a similar approach, empowering reliable capos and soldiers to manage day-to-day operations while maintaining oversight of strategic objectives. Both men demonstrated that leadership in the underworld required a combination of delegation, observation, and calculated intervention. By the early 1950s, the foundations of the Lucchese Empire were firmly in place. Tommy's reputation as a patient, intelligent, and strategic leader was cemented, allowing him to navigate rivalries, expand influence, and maintain stability within the family. Aniello Dellacroce had solidified his role as a critical enforcer, strategist, and mentor, shaping the next generation while preserving the integrity and power of the Gambino family. Together, their actions exemplified the principles of patience, strategy, and calculated influence that defined the five families and set the stage for decades of power, loyalty, and intrigue in New York. The city itself, with its streets, warehouses, and hidden corners, had become their proving ground. Every decision, every subtle maneuver, and every calculated intervention contributed to their growing legacies. Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce were no longer merely participants in the underworld. They were architects of it, shaping the dynamics of power, loyalty, and influence that would endure long after the echoes of the past had faded into the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. The streets of Brooklyn had a rhythm all their own, uneven, unpredictable, and unforgiving. By the mid-1950s, Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese had grown into a man whose presence commanded quiet respect. No longer just the boy who learned patience at a tailor shop, Tommy now stood at the center of a network that blended legitimate business with the calculated shadows of organized crime. His rise was methodical, almost imperceptible, yet every subtle maneuver strengthened his hold over Brooklyn, Manhattan, and beyond. Tommy's philosophy was simple yet effective: expand influence without drawing attention, and reinforce loyalty without overt threats. He began consolidating operations that previously belonged to rival crews, approaching these transitions with negotiation, incentives, and carefully applied pressure. One day, a small garment manufacturer resisted his overtures. Tommy didn't confront them with threats. Instead, he leveraged allies, offered favorable contracts, and positioned trusted associates in the right roles to subtly redirect the operation under his control. Within weeks, the manufacturer's compliance was voluntary, their respect for Tommy implicit. It was a demonstration of power that relied on intellect, perception, and timing rather than overt violence. While Tommy navigated the expanding empire of the Lucchese family, Aniello Mr. Dellacroce continued to solidify his own influence within the Gambino family. Aniello had mastered the art of balancing fear, loyalty, and subtle guidance. He understood that power was most secure when distributed wisely, yet concentrated where it mattered. Mentoring John Gotti was among his most critical responsibilities. Aniello drilled into Gotti the principles that had governed Brooklyn for decades: patience, calculation, observation, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. Each task, each enforcement action, was an exercise in strategic thinking and foresight, preparing Gotti for the complex dynamics that lay ahead. During this period, tensions within the five families simmered beneath the surface. Rivalries and minor disputes were common, and every family tested boundaries cautiously, seeking opportunities to expand influence or revenue. Tommy observed the Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno operations closely. His intelligence network, comprised of loyal soldiers, business allies, and informants, provided detailed insights into rival strategies. By anticipating moves and preemptively addressing conflicts, Tommy ensured that Lucchese operations remained secure while maintaining a reputation for strategic competence and subtle authority. Aniello faced parallel challenges within Gambino. The family had grown in both reach and complexity, and loyalty was tested constantly. Soldiers and capos had ambitions, and rival factions attempted subtle incursions. Aniello's enforcement was both tactical and psychological. He ensured that disputes were resolved internally, loyalty reinforced, and potential traitors neutralized quietly before any threat could escalate. His mentorship of Gotti was critical. He drilled the young man not only in action but in judgment, perception, and restraint. A single misstep, he emphasized, could undo years of careful planning. Tommy's expansion strategy was multifaceted. He cultivated legitimate enterprises that provided both cover and influence, while simultaneously orchestrating underworld operations. Import-export companies, construction contracts, and garment manufacturing were all nodes in a broader network designed to absorb risk, generate revenue, and extend authority. Each operation was meticulously monitored, with trusted lieutenants executing daily tasks while Tommy maintained oversight and strategic control. The result was an empire resilient to disruption, adaptable to change and deeply rooted in loyalty and trust. Aniello's approach emphasized the human element. He understood that people, capos, soldiers and associates, were as much instruments as they were variables. He trained Gotti to anticipate behavior, manage expectations and influence decisions subtly, often without direct confrontation. Aniello's strategies ensured that Gambino maintained stability even when rival families tested boundaries or law enforcement intensified scrutiny. He demonstrated that true power lay in the combination of perception, calculation, and decisive action at the right moment. As Tommy's influence expanded, he faced a series of subtle challenges that tested both patience and strategic skill. Rival crews occasionally questioned his authority, attempting minor incursions into territories under his control. Tommy responded not with immediate violence but through layered strategies, leveraging alliances, redistributing influence and sending clear, but measured, signals that he maintained ultimate control. These encounters reinforced his authority, strengthened loyalty, and built a reputation for intelligence, patience and calculated decisiveness. Meanwhile, Aniello confronted the complexities of mentorship and enforcement simultaneously. Gotti, ambitious and sometimes impulsive, tested boundaries. Aniello used these moments to teach lessons in patience, control and perception. Each decision, how to intervene, when to restrain, how to demonstrate consequences without unnecessary escalation, was a live exercise in strategic leadership. Through these interactions, Aniello ensured that Gotti's eventual rise would be grounded in discipline, foresight, and respect for the subtle dynamics of underworld power. The interplay of Tommy and Aniello's actions shaped the broader dynamics of New York's five families. While they operated independently, their strategies and influence were intertwined through networks of alliances, rivalries and mutual observation. Tommy's patient expansion, discreet consolidation, and intelligent delegation mirrored Aniello's methodical enforcement and mentorship. Both men understood that long-term dominance required more than strength. It required the orchestration of loyalty, perception, and calculated influence across multiple layers of operations. By the late 1950s, Tommy Lucchese had established a near-impenetrable network of influence, blending legitimate business, underworld authority, and strategic alliances. Aniello Dellacroce had secured Gambino's position, cultivated the next generation of leadership, and maintained the family's cohesion amid a volatile and competitive landscape. The combined legacy of their efforts demonstrated that the architecture of power in New York's underworld depended on observation, strategy, and the subtle application of human psychology as much as it did on force or intimidation. The streets, warehouses, offices, and backrooms of Brooklyn and Manhattan bore witness to their rise. Every calculated maneuver, every negotiated alliance, every quiet act of enforcement contributed to a landscape shaped by intelligence, discipline, and vision. Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce were no longer mere participants in the criminal ecosystem. They were architects of it, silently but decisively molding the rules, relationships, and loyalties that would define the five families for decades to come. Their stories illustrated a fundamental truth. In the world of organized crime, power is not taken. It is cultivated, observed, and exercised with precision. Loyalty is earned, betrayal is deadly, and influence flows to those who can see several moves ahead. Tommy and Aniello had mastered this game, building legacies that would echo through the streets, boardrooms, and shadows of New York for generations. The dawn of the 1960s brought new challenges and opportunities to New York's underworld. Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese had spent decades building a network of influence so intricate and disciplined that it was nearly invisible to outsiders. From the dimly lit tailor shops of his youth to warehouses filled with goods flowing through legitimate and illicit channels, every step had been calculated, measured, and executed with precision. The city had become his chessboard, and he had learned to anticipate moves several steps ahead. Tommy's rise to the top of the Lucchese family was neither sudden nor violent. It was a slow accumulation of influence, respect, and strategic alliances. He understood that brute force alone could never secure long-term power. It was subtlety, intelligence, and the careful cultivation of loyalty that defined true leadership. Over the years, he had consolidated control over multiple crews, diversified revenue streams, and built a disciplined inner circle. Each lieutenant, each soldier, and even peripheral associates were carefully chosen for loyalty, competence, and discretion. A pivotal moment came when several rival crews attempted to test his authority, encroaching on territories that Tommy had quietly brought under his control. Where others might have reacted with violence, Tommy employed negotiation, leverage, and selective intimidation. Meetings were held behind closed doors, deals were quietly brokered, and disputes resolved without public spectacle. By the end, not only had he reinforced his control, but he had also turned potential rivals into allies. It was a demonstration of the power of patience, calculation, and subtle strategy, hallmarks of his leadership style. Meanwhile, Aniello Mr. Dellacroce continued to assert his dominance within the Gambino family. His reputation as a disciplined enforcer and strategic mind had grown, and his mentorship of John Gotti was entering its most critical phase. Gotti, brash and ambitious, was learning not only to command respect but also to anticipate the consequences of every action. Aniello emphasized observation, patience, and psychological insight, the ability to read intent, influence behavior, and orchestrate outcomes without exposing himself or the family to unnecessary risk. Aniello's leadership extended beyond mentorship. He managed operations across Brooklyn and Manhattan, ensuring that Gambino interests were protected while rival families tested boundaries. Disputes were resolved internally before escalating, potential threats neutralized discreetly, and alliances carefully maintained. Aniello's balance of fear, respect, and guidance ensured that the Gambino family remained stable and cohesive even as pressures from both law enforcement and rival families intensified. Tommy and Aniello's strategies, though executed independently, were strikingly parallel. Both understood that true authority required more than aggression. It demanded foresight, control, and the subtle orchestration of perception. Tommy's empire grew quietly but effectively, blending legitimate business with criminal influence, while Aniello's mentorship and enforcement created a disciplined, loyal network capable of sustaining power. Each man was building a legacy, shaping not only their respective families but also the broader dynamics of the five families. During this period, Tommy began to formalize structures that would define the Lucchese Empire. Crews were organized with clear hierarchies, operations compartmentalized to prevent exposure, and communication channels streamlined for both efficiency and security. He cultivated relationships with influential businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement intermediaries, ensuring that the family's operations were insulated and sustainable. Every decision reinforced both authority and stability, setting the stage for decades of control. Aniello, observing rival families and internal ambitions, reinforced the Gambino family's cohesion through subtle but decisive action. Soldiers who displayed potential for disloyalty were either reined in or removed. Allies were rewarded with responsibility and trust. Gotti, under Aniello's careful guidance, learned to manage personnel, anticipate rival strategies, and assert influence without overstepping boundaries. Together, Aniello and his mentor were creating a framework for enduring power. By the mid-1960s, Tommy Lucchese had assumed the role of de facto head of the Lucchese family. His reputation as a disciplined, strategic, and patient leader allowed him to expand operations across New York, maintaining both influence and discretion. Aniello Dellacroce had positioned himself as an indispensable figure within Gambino, managing loyalty, mentoring future leaders, and ensuring that the family remained resilient amid shifting alliances and rising threats. The interplay of their influence was subtle but profound. Both men understood the stakes of the five families' power dynamics. Miscalculation could lead to violent conflict, exposure to law enforcement could destabilize entire operations, and betrayal could unravel decades of careful work. By observing rivals, cultivating loyalty, and executing strategy with precision, Tommy and Aniello demonstrated the art of leadership in a world defined by shadows, ambition, and constant risk. The city itself became a testament to their strategies. Streets, warehouses, backrooms, and offices reflected the invisible networks they had built. Networks defined by loyalty, strategy, and the disciplined orchestration of human behavior. Every decision, from negotiating a construction contract to mediating disputes between crews, reinforced their authority while minimizing risk. Their methods highlighted a fundamental truth. In the world of organized crime, power belongs to those who anticipate, adapt, and act with intelligence. By the end of this chapter, Tommy Lucchese had consolidated his position as the head of the Lucchese family, an empire blending legitimate commerce with carefully controlled underworld influence. Aniello Dellacroce had ensured the Gambino family's stability, groomed the next generation of leaders, and reinforced the principles of loyalty, discretion, and strategic enforcement. Both men had transformed from participants in a chaotic underworld to architects of enduring power, shaping not only their families but the very structure of New York's five families. Their rise illustrated the subtle but undeniable principles of influence: patience, foresight, control, and the ability to manage both people and perception. Tommy and Aniello were no longer just figures within the underworld, they were its strategists, its architects, and its legends. And as New York moved through the 1960s, their empires and mentorship would continue to define the rules, relationships, and dynamics of power for generations to come. By the late 1960s, New York's underworld had evolved into a complex network of alliances, rivalries, and shadowed operations. Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese, now firmly established as the head of the Lucchese family, was no longer simply a strategist. He was an architect of an empire. Warehouses, garment factories, construction sites, and import-export businesses all operated under his quiet, precise guidance. His genius lay in blending the legitimate with the illicit, creating a network that was profitable, resilient, and nearly untouchable. Tommy's approach to expansion was methodical. He identified key territories, measured the loyalty and competence of potential allies, and addressed rival crews with a combination of negotiation, subtle intimidation, and strategic alliances. One evening, a new crew from Queens attempted to challenge Lucchese control over a lucrative construction contract. Instead of immediate confrontation, Tommy sent a trusted lieutenant to understand their motives. He then arranged a series of private meetings, offering incentives for cooperation and aligning their interests with Lucchese operations. Within weeks, the crew had not only withdrawn its challenge but also integrated into Tommy's network, extending his influence further without a single shot fired. Meanwhile, Aniello Mr. Dellacroce was operating on another front. As Gambino's feared enforcer, his responsibilities had grown exponentially. Rival families, particularly Colombo and Genovese, were probing for weaknesses. Aniello had to anticipate moves, manage internal ambitions, and maintain the loyalty of soldiers under his supervision. His mentorship of John Gotti had reached a critical stage. The young man was learning the art of psychological control, the subtleties of negotiation, and the importance of patience. Aniello drilled into him the principle that timing and perception were often more powerful than raw strength. Tommy's empire wasn't just about revenue, it was about influence. He maintained careful oversight over all operations, from garment factories to backroom gambling dens. Crews were organized into disciplined units with clear hierarchies, ensuring accountability and loyalty. Communication flowed through trusted intermediaries, and decisions were implemented with precision. Tommy understood that his power depended as much on perception as execution. Rivals had to see him as both omnipresent and untouchable, even when he operated quietly behind the scenes. Aniello faced equally intricate challenges. Rival families were testing Gambino boundaries, internal disputes threatened cohesion, and law enforcement scrutiny intensified. He managed these pressures with a combination of enforcement, diplomacy, and mentorship. Soldiers who wavered in loyalty were subtly reminded of consequences. Ambitious capos were guided or repositioned to prevent destabilization. Gotti observed each interaction, absorbing lessons in influence, restraint, and the subtle orchestration of authority. Aniello's network became a model of discipline, loyalty, and strategic foresight. As Tommy expanded his reach, he also diversified operations geographically. Warehouses in Manhattan, import-export docks in Brooklyn, and garment shops across Queens all became nodes in a complex network of commerce and influence. Each business served multiple purposes: revenue generation, cover for underworld operations, and leverage over associates and rivals. He maintained detailed oversight, delegating operational tasks to loyal lieutenants while reserving strategic decisions for himself. The empire he was building was not only profitable but also resilient to both rival encroachments and law enforcement scrutiny. Aniello, recognizing the growing complexity of Gambino operations, applied a similar approach. He created redundancies, layered oversight, and clear chains of command. His ability to anticipate rival moves and internal ambition allowed him to neutralize potential threats before they became problems. He taught Gotti that leadership required foresight, patience, and the discipline to act decisively at precisely the right moment. Every decision reinforced loyalty, mitigated risk, and strengthened the family's overall cohesion. The interplay of Tommy and Aniello's strategies was subtle yet profound. Tommy's consolidation of influence across industries and neighborhoods mirrored Aniello's meticulous management of personnel, loyalty, and enforcement. Both men understood that the balance of power in New York depended on intelligence, observation, and strategic action. Violence was a tool of last resort, Influence, perception, and control were far more enduring. During this time, a critical event tested both men's abilities. A dispute over a construction contract threatened to escalate into a violent confrontation between Lucchese and a rival crew. Tommy, through careful negotiation and leverage, brought the crew to the table, resolving the conflict with minimal exposure. Aniello monitored parallel tensions in Gambino, ensuring that no rivals exploited the dispute to encroach on Gambino territories. The resolution underscored a central principle shared by both men. Power is maintained not by chaos but by calculated control, patience, and foresight. By the end of the 1960s, Tommy Lucchese had firmly entrenched his position as the undisputed head of the Lucchese family, with a network of operations that spanned multiple boroughs and industries. Aniello Dellacroce had ensured that Gambino remained stable, loyal, and strategically dominant, while grooming Gotti to assume future responsibilities with the same discipline and insight. Together, their influence shaped the five families, setting a standard for strategic authority, calculated enforcement, and disciplined expansion that would define organized crime in New York for decades to come. The streets, warehouses, and offices of Brooklyn and Manhattan bore silent witness to their rise. Every subtle maneuver, every carefully orchestrated alliance, and every strategic intervention reinforced their authority. Tommy and Aniello were no longer merely participants. They were architects of power, shaping the landscape of New York's underworld with intelligence, precision, and foresight. Their legacies were being written not with gunfire alone, but with strategy, patience, and an unerring understanding of human ambition. The early 1970s brought a new kind of tension to New York's underworld. Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese had firmly established the Lucchese family as a force to be reckoned with, its operations spanning neighborhoods, industries, and political circles. Aniello Mr. Dellacroce had cemented his reputation as the backbone of the Gambino family, mentoring John Gotti and overseeing the family's complex enforcement and intelligence network. Yet with influence came vulnerability. Rivals were watching, ambitious subordinates were testing boundaries, and law enforcement was increasingly relentless. Tommy faced the first serious threat when a coalition of minor crews, emboldened by perceived gaps in Lucchese territory, began encroaching on his operations. Unlike in the past, where subtle negotiation sufficed, these crews were aggressive and willing to provoke confrontation. Tommy analyzed every move, the motivations of crew leaders, their alliances, and potential vulnerabilities. He dispatched trusted lieutenants to engage in discreet diplomacy, offering incentives for compliance while subtly demonstrating the cost of resistance. By strategically rewarding loyalty and quietly undermining dissent, Tommy turned potential conflict into an expansion of influence, reinforcing his reputation as both patient and decisive. Meanwhile, Aniello confronted rival pressures on multiple fronts. The Colombo and Genovese families were probing Gambino territories, seeking opportunities to exploit weakness. Aniello deployed a layered strategy. He monitored rival activities, positioned loyal enforcers in key neighborhoods, and orchestrated operations to maintain Gambino dominance without unnecessary violence. He continued to mentor John Gotti, emphasizing anticipation, subtle influence, and the management of human ambition. Gotti observed and absorbed each lesson, gradually learning that leadership was as much about timing and perception as it was about force. Amid these rivalries, internal challenges arose. A mid-level capo in Lucchese began acting independently, bypassing chain-of-command procedures and negotiating deals without authorization. Tommy had to act carefully. Too harsh a response could provoke resentment, too lenient could invite further insubordination. He summoned the capo discreetly, assessed motivations, and offered a path that reinforced loyalty while asserting authority. The meeting concluded without escalation, but the message was clear. Tommy's leadership was precise, calculated, and unwavering. Aniello faced similar internal tension. Certain Gambino soldiers, ambitious and impatient, were testing boundaries, attempting minor expansions of territory and influence. Aniello's response combined mentorship with enforcement. He reminded them of hierarchy and consequences, repositioned them strategically, and ensured that loyalty remained uncompromised. Each interaction with Gotti reinforced these principles, training the young man to recognize subtle threats, manage allies, and act decisively when needed. Law enforcement pressure also intensified. FBI investigations, surveillance, and informants increasingly threatened to expose operations. Tommy and Aniello both understood that exposure could destabilize not only their families but the broader balance of power among the five families. Tommy implemented compartmentalization, Operations were segmented, responsibilities assigned clearly, and intermediaries insulated leadership from direct exposure. Aniello applied similar precautions, using trusted lieutenants to absorb risk while maintaining the integrity of Gambino's hierarchy. A critical incident occurred when a rival crew attempted to sabotage a Lucchese-controlled construction project. Tommy orchestrated a multifaceted response. He coordinated with allies to secure the site, discreetly applied pressure to the crew's leadership, and leveraged business relationships to protect revenue streams. The conflict was neutralized without open confrontation, but the lesson was clear. Control required foresight, coordination, and the ability to act swiftly and subtly. Aniello faced a simultaneous challenge when a group of disloyal soldiers attempted to manipulate Gotti's position for personal gain. Aniello identified the actors, reasserted the chain of command, and reinforced loyalty through both mentorship and strategic consequence. These simultaneous pressures illustrated the delicate balance both men maintained. Influence could be undermined internally as easily as externally, and leadership demanded constant vigilance, insight, and adaptability. Throughout this period, both men demonstrated mastery over the art of perception. Tommy cultivated an image of calm, measured authority, ensuring that allies, rivals, and rivals' allies recognized both his influence and strategic acumen. Aniello did the same within Gambino, blending mentorship, enforcement, and subtle intimidation. Each action was calculated. Perception often dictated behavior before action was even necessary. By the mid-1970s, the five families were entrenched in a tense equilibrium. Tommy's Lucchese family operated with authority, influence, and discipline, while Aniello maintained Gambino cohesion and prepared Gotti for eventual leadership. Both men had navigated betrayals, rivalries, and law enforcement scrutiny, demonstrating the value of patience, foresight, and calculated action. Their strategies were complementary: expansion through intelligence, control through loyalty, and authority through perception. The chapter closes with an understanding of the stakes. In New York's underworld, loyalty is precious, betrayal is deadly, and power is earned through discipline, observation, and strategic foresight. Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce had solidified their positions, built resilient networks, and trained the next generation to sustain influence. The five families were balanced precariously, yet under their watch, stability endured. The shadows of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens hid countless lessons, alliances, and threats, each of which both men had learned to navigate with mastery. By the late 1970s, the shadows of New York streets were more dangerous than ever, not because of rival crews or internal betrayal, but because of the watchful eyes of law enforcement. The FBI had sharpened its focus on organized crime, employing wiretaps, surveillance, informants, and carefully orchestrated investigations to expose the intricate networks that Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese and Aniello Mr. Dellacroce had painstakingly built over decades. Tommy Lucchese understood that visibility was a double-edged sword. His empire had grown vast and profitable, but every operation, every warehouse, every business venture was now potentially under scrutiny. He relied on discretion, compartmentalization, and loyal intermediaries to shield himself from direct exposure. Legitimate businesses provided cover, but the underworld components required vigilance, strategic delegation, and careful management of personnel. Every subordinate, every transaction, and every shipment was now a potential vector of risk. Aniello Dellacroce faced a parallel challenge. Gambino operations were increasingly exposed to law enforcement pressure. Rival families sought advantage, sensing that even the most disciplined structures could be destabilized under scrutiny. Aniello's solution was multi-layered: enforce strict loyalty, maintain secure channels of communication, and mentor John Gotti to think several steps ahead. Gotti learned to anticipate both internal and external pressures, understanding that discretion, perception, and timing were as critical as force. The first major test came when federal agents intercepted suspicious financial activity linked to Lucchese-controlled businesses. Tommy's response was meticulous. He reviewed operations, traced potential leaks, and reinforced oversight across multiple nodes of his empire. Subordinates were reminded to maintain secrecy, legitimate businesses were scrutinized for vulnerabilities, and rival crews were monitored for potential opportunistic actions. By controlling the narrative and tightening operational security, Tommy ensured that investigations did not compromise the family's core activities. Simultaneously, Aniello managed internal vulnerabilities within the Gambino family. Some soldiers had begun to feel pressure from increased scrutiny, while others contemplated alliances with rival factions. Aniello acted swiftly, neutralizing risks through discreet disciplinary action and mentorship. Each move reinforced the principle that loyalty was non-negotiable and that missteps would be corrected decisively but discreetly. His ability to combine strategic oversight with subtle enforcement became a cornerstone of Gambino resilience. A particularly tense episode involved a rival family attempting to exploit perceived weaknesses in Lucchese territory. Tommy's intelligence network detected unusual activity. Shipments diverted, intermediaries probing alliances, and minor crews testing boundaries. Tommy coordinated a response without alerting rivals to his awareness. Meetings were held privately, alliances were recalibrated, and strategic pressure was applied where necessary. By the end, the challenge had dissipated, and Lucchese's influence was stronger than before, a testament to careful strategy and measured action. Aniello faced a simultaneous threat when law enforcement began targeting individuals connected to Gambino's operations. He deployed trusted intermediaries to handle sensitive transactions, reorganized internal chains of command, and ensured that potential informants were monitored. He guided Gotti in navigating these pressures, teaching him to read signals, anticipate outcomes, and act decisively when timing was critical. Through these lessons, Gotti learned the subtle interplay between power, perception, and survival in a landscape increasingly dominated by scrutiny. Tommy's expansion strategy was adapted to these pressures. He emphasized decentralized operations, redundancy, and the use of legitimate business as both cover and leverage. Allies were carefully vetted, subordinates trained in operational security, and rival interactions measured for risk. Each decision was deliberate, visibility was minimized, influence was maximized, and every move reinforced both authority and resilience. Aniello's enforcement mirrored this philosophy. Threats were neutralized quietly, loyalties reinforced, and Gotti's education continued through practical example. The Gambino family, under Aniello's guidance, maintained cohesion even as FBI pressure intensified. Aniello demonstrated that leadership under scrutiny required calm, foresight, and the ability to manipulate both human behavior and circumstance to maintain stability. During this period, both Tommy and Aniello learned that true power required adaptation. The rules of the streets had shifted. Law enforcement was no longer a background threat, it was an active adversary. Both men adjusted their strategies, blending discretion, intelligence, and subtle enforcement to ensure that empires remained intact. The city's landscape, once shaped solely by rivalry and ambition, now included a layer of unseen surveillance and calculated countermeasures, making leadership a delicate balance of action, restraint, and perception. By the end of the decade, Tommy Lucchese had solidified his position as the head of a disciplined, resilient empire, capable of withstanding both rival families and the prying eyes of law enforcement. Aniello Dellacroce had fortified the Gambino family, mentored the next generation, and ensured that John Gotti was prepared to navigate the complex interplay of loyalty, strategy, and survival. Together, their actions underscored a central truth. In New York's underworld, survival was as much about intelligence and foresight as it was about loyalty and force. The streets, warehouses, offices, and backrooms bore silent witness to decades of calculated expansion, mentorship, and enforcement. Tommy and Aniello were no longer merely participants. They were architects of power, masters of strategy, and the invisible hands shaping the five families. Each decision, each alliance, each subtle maneuver reinforced their authority and ensured that their legacies would endure, even under the relentless pressure of law enforcement and the ceaseless ambitions of rivals. The 1980s arrived with a shift in the tides of New York's underworld. Decades of meticulous planning, strategic maneuvering, and disciplined expansion had solidified the empires of Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese and Aniello Mr. Dellacroce. Yet, even the most carefully constructed dynasties are subject to the inevitable forces of time, mortality, and changing circumstances. Tommy Lucchese, once a boy who learned patience in a dimly lit tailor shop, had grown into an emblem of disciplined power. His empire was vast, blending legitimate enterprises with underworld influence across Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens. Yet as he aged, the mechanisms he had put in place faced new pressures: ambitious subordinates, rival families testing boundaries, and the ever-watchful eyes of law enforcement. Tommy understood that legacy was not built on fear alone. It required stability, loyalty, and systems capable of surviving beyond the lifespan of their architect. By the early 1980s, health and age began to catch up with Tommy. He remained sharp and observant, but the day-to-day oversight of operations increasingly relied on trusted lieutenants. The streets, warehouses, and offices he had meticulously organized ran smoothly, a testament to his strategic foresight. Yet the absence of his constant presence subtly shifted the dynamics among associates, testing loyalties and judgment. Tommy's careful orchestration of authority and influence ensured that these transitions occurred with minimal disruption, preserving both the integrity of operations and the cohesion of his family. Aniello Dellacroce faced a different kind of pressure. As Gambino's stalwart enforcer and strategist, he had long been the mentor of John Gotti and the overseer of the family's most sensitive operations. Aniello's authority was rooted in discipline, respect, and the mastery of psychological influence. He understood that leadership extended beyond enforcement. It required preparation for succession, guidance for ambitious lieutenants, and the anticipation of threats both internal and external. The death of Tommy Lucchese would serve as a critical example for Aniello and his protégés, reinforcing the importance of foresight, patience, and strategic planning. The passing of Tommy Lucchese marked the end of an era. Within the Lucchese family, operations continued without upheaval, a testament to the systems he had meticulously built. Subordinates executed responsibilities with precision, alliances remained intact, and rival families observed silently, recognizing the enduring influence of the empire's founder. Though he was gone, his philosophy endured. Measured influence, disciplined control, and the subtle orchestration of loyalty and perception were more enduring than violence alone. Aniello's reaction to these shifts was pragmatic. The Gambino family faced increasing scrutiny from law enforcement, internal ambition from rising soldiers, and the potential for rival exploitation. Aniello strengthened operational security, reassigned responsibilities, and reinforced the principles of loyalty and discipline that had guided the family for decades. Mentoring Gotti, he emphasized that survival and influence required foresight, adaptability, and strategic patience. Each decision Aniello made reinforced stability and prepared the family for continued prominence in the complex landscape of New York organized crime. During this period, the balance of power across the five families experienced subtle shifts. Alliances were renegotiated, loyalties reassessed, and rivalries tested. The structures that Tommy and Aniello had established allowed their respective families to absorb these pressures without collapse. Tommy's empire, though now led by successors, remained resilient. Aniello's mentorship ensured that Gambino retained cohesion, influence, and the capacity to respond to external and internal challenges. A defining characteristic of both men's legacies was their emphasis on people as instruments and variables. Tommy had trained lieutenants to manage operations, anticipate threats, and execute strategy. Aniello had molded Gotti and others to navigate the nuances of human behavior, perception, and loyalty. Both understood that leadership was an interplay between structure, discipline, and the ability to manipulate circumstances subtly yet decisively. The eventual passing of Aniello Dellacroce reinforced the fragility and inevitability of transition. With his mentorship guiding Gotti and other operatives, the Gambino family retained its strength and continuity. The lessons Aniello imparted, patience, observation, strategic enforcement, and calculated influence, ensured that the family would continue to thrive despite his absence. Similarly, the structures Tommy Lucchese had established enabled the Lucchese family to endure, maintaining cohesion, profitability, and influence without the constant presence of its founder. By the mid-1980s, both empires reflected a new reality. The men who had built them were gone, yet their influence remained embedded in the very fabric of the five families. Their strategic foresight, disciplined management, and understanding of human behavior had created networks resilient to betrayal, rival pressure, and law enforcement scrutiny. The streets, offices, warehouses, and boardrooms of New York were indelibly shaped by their actions, a living testament to their intelligence, patience, and foresight. The legacy of Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce illustrates a timeless truth about leadership in extreme environments. Influence is not wielded through force alone, but through strategy, discretion, and the careful orchestration of perception and loyalty. Both men had mastered the balance of power, preparing their families to endure beyond their lifetimes. Their stories demonstrate that true authority is earned through patience, observation, and calculated action, and that the impact of such leadership can resonate for generations. As New York moved toward a new decade, the five families remained a testament to decades of meticulous strategy, disciplined enforcement, and careful cultivation of loyalty. Tommy Lucchese's empire continued under trusted successors. Aniello Dellacroce's protégés carried forward his principles, and John Gotti, now seasoned by years of mentorship, began to emerge as a force capable of navigating the complex interplay of loyalty, power, and ambition. The legacies of these two men were secure, not because of fear or violence alone, but because of intelligence, foresight, and the careful cultivation of systems and people that could endure the relentless pressures of New York's underworld. The shadows of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens held countless stories of alliances, betrayals, and strategic brilliance. Within those shadows, Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce remained legends, not merely of criminal enterprise but of leadership, strategy, and enduring influence in a city that never slept. Their names and the principles they embodied would echo through the five families for decades, shaping the very rules by which loyalty, power, and survival were measured. The city of New York had long been a proving ground for ambition, strategy, and survival. Streets, warehouses, backrooms, and boardrooms bore witness to decades of negotiation, loyalty, betrayal, and calculated action. At the center of this complex web stood two men whose influence would endure far beyond their lifetimes: Tommy Three-Finger Lucchese and Aniello Mr. Dellacroce. Their legacies were not defined solely by territory, profit, or violence, but by the intelligence, foresight, and discipline with which they built and maintained their empires. Tommy Lucchese's journey from a boy in a tailor shop to the head of the Lucchese family was a masterclass in patience, strategy, and observation. Every stitch he once studied, every subtle gesture he had noticed in his youth, had contributed to the development of a keen mind for influence and negotiation. He understood that true power depended on loyalty, perception, and the disciplined orchestration of people and resources. By the end of his life, Lucchese had built an empire that spanned multiple boroughs, industries, and social circles, a network resilient to betrayal, rival encroachment, and law enforcement scrutiny. Aniello Dellacroce, operating alongside and within the Gambino family, exemplified the art of enforcement, mentorship, and strategic oversight. He guided John Gotti and other protégés, teaching them that authority is earned through discretion, patience, and intelligence as much as through intimidation or force. Aniello maintained cohesion within the Gambino family, neutralized threats, and managed rivalries with subtle precision. His methods ensured that the family remained powerful, disciplined, and resilient, even under the pressures of scrutiny and internal ambition. Together, the lives of Lucchese and Dellacroce illustrate complementary approaches to power. Tommy expanded influence through careful observation, strategic alliances, and the blending of legitimate and illicit enterprises. Aniello maintained stability through disciplined enforcement, mentorship, and the subtle orchestration of loyalty and perception. Both men understood that survival and authority in New York's underworld required more than force. It required foresight, patience, and an understanding of human behavior that was both precise and adaptable. The five families themselves were profoundly shaped by their strategies. Lucchese's disciplined network became a model for measured expansion, combining legitimate commerce with underworld influence in a way that minimized risk and maximized control. Gambino, under Aniello's guidance, maintained cohesion and resilience, ensuring that both loyalty and fear were balanced to sustain long-term stability. Their influence extended far beyond immediate operations. It created frameworks, standards, and methods that would govern organized crime in New York for decades. Throughout their careers, both men navigated complex dynamics: rival families probing for weakness, ambitious subordinates testing boundaries, law enforcement monitoring operations, and internal disputes threatening cohesion. Yet their responses were calculated, deliberate, and precise. Conflicts were often resolved quietly, loyalty reinforced through a combination of respect and consequence, and authority projected without unnecessary exposure. Their ability to anticipate moves, manage perception, and orchestrate outcomes set them apart from more impulsive figures in the underworld. Tommy and Aniello's legacies were also defined by mentorship. Lucchese cultivated loyal lieutenants, ensuring that operational systems could endure beyond his personal involvement. Aniello's guidance of John Gotti and others prepared a new generation to navigate the complexities of leadership, loyalty, and survival. Through these protégés, the principles of strategic influence, patience, and disciplined authority continued to shape the families and the broader dynamics of New York organized crime long after the founders themselves had passed. The enduring lesson of their lives is clear. In the underworld, true power is cultivated, not seized. Loyalty must be earned, influence carefully orchestrated, and authority maintained through strategy as much as through enforcement. Both men demonstrated that survival, dominance, and legacy are achieved through the combination of intelligence, foresight, and disciplined action, rather than mere aggression or intimidation. Even in death, their influence persisted. The streets, warehouses, and offices that once felt their presence continued to operate according to the principles they had instilled. Allies and rivals alike respected the structures, hierarchies, and networks they had created. Successors, guided by their examples, carried forward the lessons of strategy, discretion, and patient accumulation of power. The five families, though forever changing, bore the imprint of their intelligence and vision, a testament to the enduring strength of carefully applied leadership. Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce left behind more than empires. They left blueprints for leadership in complex, high-stakes environments. Their methods, measured influence, strategic foresight, mentorship, and disciplined enforcement, offer insight into the art of authority under conditions of uncertainty, competition, and constant threat. Their stories reveal the subtle interplay of loyalty, perception, and calculated action that defines not only organized crime but any system in which power must be maintained and transferred. As New York continued to evolve, the legacy of these men remained palpable. Streets that once carried the whispers of deals, threats, and negotiations still echoed with their strategies. Associates who had learned under their guidance carried lessons forward. Rival families, observing their structures and influence, recognized the enduring principles that had allowed Lucchese and Dellacroce to dominate without chaos, to expand influence without reckless confrontation, and to secure loyalty without relying solely on fear. The city itself had become a living testament to their acumen. Every brick, every alley, every office space where decisions were quietly executed bore witness to decades of foresight, strategy, and leadership. Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce had transformed New York's underworld into an intricate, disciplined system where power, loyalty, and survival were measured not by brute force alone, but by intelligence, observation, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. In the end, the stories of Tommy Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce are not merely tales of organized crime, they are lessons in leadership, strategy, and the enduring power of foresight and discipline. Their legacies endure in the networks they built, the protégés they trained, and the principles they embodied. The five families, forever shaped by their influence, continue to reflect the careful, calculated, and patient application of authority that these men perfected. They remain in every sense, legends of New York's underworld, architects of power, masters of strategy, and enduring symbols of disciplined influence in a city defined by ambition, loyalty, and survival.